In my last talk, I looked at the town moor, with particular emphasis on the rather grim period when it saw the largest single mass execution of witches in England. But of course there was one aspect of the moor I only mentioned in passing, the most important one, and sadly, one that nobody will be enjoying this summer. This year there will be no hoppings on Newcastle's town moor. This brings home for many of us how much a part of life this funfair is. But how much do most of us know about the hoppings? When did it start and why? And how did it evolve down the years, until now it hangs in suspended animation, waiting, like the rest of us, for the pandemic to subside? Well, it might come as a surprise to hear that it all began as part of a national war on alcohol. One of the aspects of British history we don't really think about much is the temperance movement. As I record this, during lockdown, millions of people are sitting at home glugging booze and wishing the pubs and the restaurants and the nightclubs were all open again. Not drinking is still seen to some extent as a tad eccentric. We've become inured to readily available alcohol. But in Victorian times there was a massive anti-alcohol movement to which millions signed up. There were very good reasons for this. At the start of the 19th century, drinking was almost unregulated. Gin was called Mother's Ruin for a reason. In Hogarth's famous painting Gin Alley, the slogan above the shop reads, "Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for twopence, clean straw for nothing." That was in the 18th century, but the Industrial Revolution arguably made things worse thanks to a massive expansion of cities. Attempts were made to encourage what we'd call sensible drinking. The Duke of Wellington, no less, devised the modern public house as an alternative to the gin shop. But drunkenness remained a huge social problem. It led to violence, of course, and serious illness. Businesses didn't like drunkenness because it undermined the economy. Christians didn't like it because it was morally depraved. This is why the temperance movement was strongest among church-going types, small businessmen, and the better educated working classes. There was also a surprising political dimension to the temperance campaign. It sprang from the same origins as the Chartist movement, which wanted to give working men the vote. One of the common accusations levelled by the upper and middle classes against the poor was that they were drunkards, and therefore too irresponsible to vote. The temperance movement was, in part, aimed at proving that stereotype wrong. One target of the movement on Tyneside was Race Week. The last week in June, at Newcastle's racecourse, was notorious for drinking, gambling, and general naughtiness. That's why the hoppings was scheduled for the end of June, to create an alternative booze-free attraction for Geordies. The hoppings was first held for just one day in 1882, clashing with the big attraction, the Northumberland Plate. But what about the name, Dave? Why is it called the hoppings? Well, rather embarrassingly, nobody seems to know. However, old-time fairs always involved dancing, and we all know going to the hop means going to a dance. It could therefore be that when it was first devised, those Victorian lads and lasses thought of it as a traditional fair and anticipated much hopping about. OK, that explanation sounds a bit feeble when you say it out loud. Our next possibility is a bit offensive. Poor people used to get infested with fleas, so when you went to any large public gathering, chances are you'd get a few fleas in your undergarments. So the fleas were seen hopping about, and indeed so were the people they bit. It was a flea fest, basically. That sounds plausible, sadly enough, but there is another more ancient derivation. The Anglo-Saxons had fairs called hoppins, apparently. So perhaps the name survived, a posh person overheard a Geordie using it and concluded they were saying hoppings, which in fact they weren't, so that's all very confusing. Right, having digressed a bit, what was that very sober hoppings like? Well, this was the 19th century, so there were none of the rides we have nowadays. And remember, it was just for one day, not a week. But let's hear from the Illustrated London News of July the 8th, 1882, which published a piece by the Temperance Festival manager, Mr. R. F. Liddell. A temperance festival was held the same day on the town moor, Newcastle-on-Tyne, where the races have been held for nearly 150 years. The removal of the races to Gosforth Park, where the admission fee was £1, leads to the counter-attraction in the way of public amusements. A band contest, football, cricket, foot racing and other sports were organised, for which good prizes were given, and addresses were delivered. The people present were estimated at 150,000. No intoxicating drinks were allowed to be sold. So there. Some estimates put the turnout at 200,000, so Mr. Little was being rather modest. The first one-day hoppings was a huge success. It became an annual event, and in 1883 the organisers dubbed it a Carnival of the People of the North. By 1888 the festival had been extended to 3 days, with the first day dedicated to Highland Games. Yes, tossing the caber and all that. By 1895, Newcastle Corporation was taking £500 in rent from the showmen. The first hoppings had generated just £10, so clearly the fair had taken off. In 1897 the rent went up to £750, and a huge bonfire was lit to mark Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. This also marked the first year when a showman, William Murphy, ran the entire operation. Another figure linked to the early hoppings was Alderman Stevens, who opened the fair several times and was officially president of the festival. In 1891 he had his watch stolen on his way to the hoppings, and temperance campaigners bought him a new one. Sadly, Alderman Stevens died before he could celebrate the 21st anniversary of the hoppings, which he'd helped firmly establish as a Newcastle institution. By 1900 the hoppings was officially known as the Race Week Fair, and with a new century came new attractions. In 1906 there was a game of mounted pushball, a kind of footy on horseback, with the teams dressed in the colours of Newcastle and Sunderland. This did not catch on. In 1907 the North Eastern Roundabout Syndicate was formed to ensure that the fair remained under the control of local showmen. This followed rows about the involvement of showmen from Glasgow and Manchester in previous years. It was in 1909 that the hoppings was extended to a full week, and this was largely down to bad weather. The first 3 days were so wet that the corporation granted an extension to the showmen to let them recoup their losses. The 5-day hoppings had arrived. Success, of course, always brings its own problems. In 1911 the freemen of Newcastle brought a lawsuit against the Roundabout Syndicate to try and stop the hoppings, because they claimed it ruined the pasturage for their cattle and sheep. The showmen had to pay damages of £214. The fair went ahead, but there was an extended wrangle over jurisdiction. It was finally decided that the freemen of the city could veto the hoppings, if they chose. After that, the First World War threatened to put an end to the hoppings for good. Troops were trained on the town moor, and a small airfield was built. The Temperance Fair moved to Green Pool Field in Jesmond Vale and stayed there until 1923. It was a much smaller event, and some felt it had had its day. Enter a hero in the person of Arthur Fenwick of shop window fame. He campaigned for a revival of the old hoppings. He said, "To stop the showmen coming onto the moor was for them just as serious a business as would be the closing of the Tyne to the shipping community." The corporation was swayed, and the hoppings returned to the moor. This was, though, the time of the Great Depression, and people didn't have much money to spend. Many couldn't afford the cost of a festival programme, which was twopence. But by the 30s, the hoppings was on the up again and had evolved into the kind of fair many of us remember. Basic rides, like roundabouts, were replaced with faster, more elaborate attractions. The Second World War interrupted the fun, but afterwards the hoppings was revived again, and the number of rides skyrocketed. Here are just a few that have pulled in the crowds since then. The Carousel, the Rotor, Equinox, the Jungle River Flume, Wild Thing Tagada, River Rapids, Big Ben, Dodgems, Power Surge, Super Bowl, Waltzer, Sizzler, Matterhorn, Top Spin, Vertigo Booster, Over the Top, The Roller, Speed Flip, Move It, Toboggan. Oh, and in 1958, Hook the Duck appeared for the first time. You'd think they'd have figured that one out around 1890, but what do I know? The hoppings had its fair share of characters down the years. One was Nellie Beattie, who took charge of the Lost Children's Tent in 1933 and finally retired in 1965. The number of lost children rose year on year. There was, however, a widespread belief that this wasn't so much down to parental carelessness as the fact that Ma Beattie famously gave them sweets while they waited to be collected. Altogether sadder was the fate of one living attraction, Edith Barlow. Known as Little Edie, she was billed as the smallest woman in Britain, at just 22 inches high. She took ill at the Hoppings in 1957 and died of pneumonia in hospital at the age of 28. She was a 40-a-day smoker. Not long after, exhibiting human beings at fairgrounds went out of fashion. Since those days, the Hoppings has had its ups and downs, but it grew to become the biggest travelling funfair in Europe with over 300 attractions. Those Victorian temperance campaigners really started something, but I won't suggest raising a glass to them. Perhaps a nice cup of tea and a bicky would be more appropriate.